Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm reviewing the new album from Nas Nasir, and this is a follow-up to his 2012 album, and it's been a while since we've gotten a full album from Nas, and you can tell by the fact that his last album, like I just said, was released in 2012, it's now 2018. It's been a long time since we've gotten a full-length project from Nas. And this album has been hyped up for a good while now. For many years at this point, there was times where he said the album was done, and I guess it wasn't done because we didn't get the album anytime soon later, and just sort of this back and forth that's kind of gone on, people hoping to get the album soon, and apparently it's done, but it's not done, and all of this. And now, if it's finally done, and we could finally hear it and listen to it, and, enjoy it, or not enjoy it, depending on, personal taste. But regardless, it's here, and this is also the fourth album being released as part of this series of albums that are 7 tracks, really short in length, produced by Kanye West. And I did review the 3 albums preceding this one: Pusha T's Daytona, Kanye West Yay, and the Kids See Ghost album, all on my channel. You can check out those reviews if you want to see my thoughts on those. But pretty much this album, I had high hopes going into this one, given that, I generally enjoy Nas's music. I don't think all of his albums have been great necessarily, but I do enjoy his music for the most part, and he does have some classics under his belt. And also, I do feel like this short form format for an album where there's pretty much no filler and just a bunch of great tracks, I feel like that could work well with Nas, especially considering like his first album, for example, while not as short as this album or any of the albums being released as part of this 7-song series. I don't know what to call it exactly. But his first album was also relatively short, and it was an example of an album that was really just all filler and no killer at all. So I hope to get the same here. And really what I ended up getting from this project is a decent album overall. I would say that I like this project for the most part, but it definitely has some weak moments to it. And I don't think it's an example of, an album that's taking the full advantage of this short length format that lots of these, preceding albums have done. It's just a decent project overall, I would say. I feel like the biggest problem with this project is simply that it isn't an example of an album that is just, all hits and no filler at all, because there are a few tracks on here that do kind of feel like filler, which on a project of this length is pretty much unacceptable. I mean, if this album had been like 40 minutes or 50 minutes, a more, normal length for an album, I feel like having, 1 or 2 or 3 more just average filler-like tracks could be okay, but on an album like this where, that's almost like half the album or like a third of the album, that's a pretty big deal, and it can really drag down the whole experience of this project. On this album, there's 3 tracks in particular that I feel are more filler-like than the others. The first of these is White Label, which is a track that doesn't really have all too much wrong with it. I like Nas's flow on the track, I like the production, but at the same time there's nothing that's really exceptional about the track. There's nothing that really compels me to return to it and give it more repeated listens, either in the context of the album or on its own. It's just an average song overall. The following track, Bonjour, is another one that, while it's probably my favorite of these 3 songs, still just feels a bit too average to be on an album this short. I like Nas's flow on the track. Overall, I like the production as well, but it's just nothing about it is super standout to me again. And in the closing track, Simple Things is another one that feels just very middle of the road to me. Once again, Nas's flow is fine, his lyrics are fine, the production is fine, but none of them are super exceptional, I feel, and that's the biggest problem with it. Also, with this closing track, I hate how it just kind of cuts off at the end. The first time I was listening to it, I thought something was wrong with my Spotify where I was listening to it on. I just thought that something had happened to it and it cut off, but no, that's just how the album ends. Which is kind of disappointing, and it really just is a nice representation of the album as a whole. It has some good things going for it, and then it just cuts off, and it's not that interesting in the end. The other 4 tracks on this album I do enjoy, however. To varying degrees, of course, but I would say that they are tracks that I enjoy overall. On the opening track, Not For Radio, I think it's a very solid opener. I think Nas sounds good on this track. The only thing I really don't care for on it are Diddy's just kind of hype man-like things that he has going on here. He'll just kind of interject his own, shouts in the middle of this track that are, relevant to some extent to what's going on in the song, in the lyrics, but I just felt like were a little unnecessary in the end. Nas was doing perfectly fine on his own, on here. I didn't really need the ad-lib sort of yelling things going on. On the second track, Cop Shot the Kids, I really like the sample that's used here for the chorus. I think it sounds very nice. And just throughout this project as a whole, I would say Kanye West's production is pretty good as well. I mean, I've liked his production for the most part on these past 4 albums or so in this series that he's been doing. I've always felt like even on the weaker albums, like his solo album, I felt like the production was one of the stronger points on that thing. And here, again, I feel like his production is one of the stronger points here on this album. But one thing I didn't really expect was to like his features on this album as much as I ended up doing. On the track Cop Shot the Kid, I like how his feature on here is, I like the lyrics on his feature. I feel like, he's not really talking about himself, which is something I tend to like from him when he's just talking about other things aside from himself, so I feel like this feature worked for him. And then his feature on the track Everything, which is another track on here that I enjoy a good amount. I feel like his singing on this track sounded pretty nice overall. And speaking of Everything, I do like this track as well, and even though it is one of the longer cuts on this album, I feel like it's one of the cuts on here with more going on in it. I like the sung parts, like I said before, and Nas's verses on here are also pretty good. And I like how the track sort of has a, not necessarily grand feel to it, because I wouldn't necessarily say it's grand and over the top or anything, but I do like how it has an important feel to it, which you can kind of get from its runtime, and it certainly justifies that runtime with what it does in the track. I also feel like the track that immediately follows it, Adam and Eve, is another good one on here. It's definitely just one of the most solid cuts on this thing. I like Nas's rapping, I like his lyrics on this thing, I feel like the production is pretty good as well. And while I said those same things about a lot of the tracks on here that I didn't care for as much, I feel like on this track everything is just a bit better, a bit more memorable, and it's just, firing on all cylinders a lot more than it is on some of the more forgettable cuts on this thing. So overall, I feel like this album is just very, decent, I would say. It's definitely above average. I feel like I enjoy listening to this thing, yet I don't really feel all that compelled to return to it for repeated listens in the future, outside of maybe a couple of the tracks in the track listing here. There are definitely some cuts on this thing that I don't really feel like are super memorable. Those 3 tracks I mentioned earlier in particular, I feel like you could have cut from here, and it would have been a lot more, concise in terms of the quality, but at the same time, it would have been too short to be an album then, I feel. It would have been more like, an EP. And this album being the longest, at least as of now, out of all the ones that Kanye has released as part of this series, I don't really feel like it should have been the longest necessarily. I feel like you could have easily cut at least one of those 3 tracks out, and it still could have, fit the runtime of an acceptable album by the standards of what Kanye has been doing in this series. And I feel like this longer length is in part due to the length of the track Everything, which is one thing I did like about that track, so I don't want that to really get changed around or anything quite like that. This is an album where I feel like there's lots of, positive elements to it, whether it be the production. I feel like most of the features on here are good, like I said before, with the exception of maybe, the opening track with Diddy. I didn't really care for that all that much. But the only thing on here that I feel like is kind of weak is just Nas himself at times. His flows, for the most part sound fine. His lyrics on here are, decent, I would say. They're not his greatest lyrics that he's ever, put to paper or anything quite like that. He does have some shining moments on here, but he also has some moments that are pretty forgettable in terms of the lyrics. It's just a decent project overall. And while that's an okay thing, I mean, like I said, it's not a bad album. It's not even an average album, I would say. It's above that. I still feel like given the hype I had going into this thing, I was maybe a little bit let down, given all the years of waiting. And, it's finally here, and, it's decent. It's not a bad album by any means, but it's not something that I'm super excited about or anything quite like that. I'd really recommend this album to Nas fans, though I'm guessing if you're a Nas fan, you've probably already listened to this thing multiple times. Or just hip-hop fans in general, you'll probably get at least some enjoyment out of this album. And it's so short that, you could at least give it one listen to see if you like it or not. But yeah, those are really the groups I'd recommend it to. And with that said, that is just my own personal opinion. So if you happen to disagree, if you love this thing, or if you absolutely hate this thing, if you're, on one of the extreme ends of things as opposed to me, who's more so in the middle, I guess you could say, feel free to leave your own opinion in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content like album reviews and things like that. Thank you guys for watching, and stay golden.